Okay, this is a 9 for a review for your algebra, sections 10.1 through 10.4 in Mathlinks 8. The outcomes are pretty self-explanatory, but we'll go through each of them one at a time. If you're having any difficulty with one particular type, obviously if this is 2 or 3 days from now, you're not going to remember the answer, but you can try and solve it again. So just press pause on a question, do it real quick, and see if you were correct with your solution. The first question asks you to solve by inspection. Now, what I want you to do on the test, if it says solve by inspection, I want you to write the question out so that I know you are interpreting it. So you have to write out this. Half of what number is negative 3? Or half of a number is negative 3. What's the number? So half of what number is negative 3? The answer is half of negative 6. So the solution by inspection is negative 6 divided by 2 equals negative 3. And the second part, what number multiplied by negative 2 is negative 8? What number multiplied by negative 2 is negative 8? The answer is positive 4. Negative 2 times positive 4 is negative 8. So on a test, what I'm really looking for you to be able to do is twofold. Be able to interpret it by writing out the question. What is it you're asking yourself to solve by inspection? And for the second point, what is the answer? Question 2 takes those same questions, but instead of solving by inspection, says solve by modeling. So the first one, I'll bring this down here. The first one says half of x is equal to negative 3. So when we model it, we're going to draw half of x is equal to negative 3. Now, of course, from a modeling perspective, our goal is not to know what half an x is. We want to know what a full x is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double this side, and I'm going to double this side, because whatever I do to one side, if I do to the other, I maintain balance. And we know, if I take this and rotate it, that 2 halves of x make a full x, and therefore a full x would be equal to negative 6. In the second model, it says negative 2x is equal to negative or positive 8. And if 2 negative x's is equal to negative 8, then each of those negative x's is equal to positive 4. Those are the worst positives ever. Equals positive 4. And if a negative x equals a positive 4, then we realize the opposite of negative x is positive x, and the opposite of negative 4 is positive 4. So therefore, x equals a negative 4. And our last question takes those same 3 questions and asks us to solve with opposite operation. Much easier. I'll use my pink marker this time. I don't use it very often. So if it says half of x is equal to negative 3, when we modeled it, we doubled both sides. So we're going to do the same thing numerically. We're going to multiply both sides by 2, which is the same thing as doubling both sides. And if you have half an x, you now have a full x, because the opposite to dividing by 2 is multiplying by 2, gives you a full x. And negative 3 times 2 is negative 6. Over here, the second question says negative 2 multiplied by x. The opposite of multiplying by negative 2 is dividing by negative 2. So we're going to do that onto both sides. And we're going to be left with x equals negative 4. Question number 4 asks us to interpret and solve. So that's half an x. But this little negative symbol here tells me that it's not half an x, but rather a negative half of x. So the way we write that, this would be half of x. And a negative half of x, we were told to put your negative symbol in the denominator. You could have put it here if you wanted to. And you could have also put it here if you wanted to. But we said that the easiest place to put your negative symbol is the denominator, because that is still a negative half of x. So a negative half of x minus 2 is equal to 4. First thing we're going to do to both sides is get rid of the constant by adding 2. And if you're still having a difficult time remembering get rid of the constant, just remind yourself that I'm constantly reminding you to get rid of it first. In which case you're left with a negative half of x is equal to 6. You're going to multiply both sides not by positive 2, but by negative 2. And x will equal and negative 12. Your next question gives you three expressions and asks you to define the constant and the coefficient. The constant in the first expression is, remember, the constant is the term on the variable side, that we use integer chips for. So the integer chips in this one, I would have drawn a negative half of x. What's this? This is a negative, and a negative 3 integer chips. So therefore, our constant is negative 3, and our coefficient, how much of x you have, how much of x. And if I read that properly, it's a negative half. So a negative half is negative 0.5. You could also say negative 1 over 2 if you wanted to. Either one of those is the same thing. In the second question, 4 minus 2x, I would draw 4 integer chips. So a positive 4 is my constant. And my coefficient for how much x I have, just to remember, I'd have a positive 4 and a negative 2x. So how much of x do I have? I have negative 2 groups of x. So negative 2 is your coefficient. And finally, the third one, what's your constant? It's positive 1.5. And your coefficient is a tenth. And a tenth can be written as 0.1 or 1 over 10. Your next question asks you to interpret and solve. So my constant is negative 3. Minus 2x is equal to a positive 9. So the interpretation of the model looks like this. Get rid of your constant first by adding 3. Negative 2x will equal 12. Divide both sides by the coefficient of negative 2. And x equals a negative 6. Question number, whatever this is solved by modeling. And what this is asking you to do is it's asking two things. So what this says that I circled, it's two things. It is 4 groups of x minus 2, or you could say it's 4 x's and it's minus 8. What I've circled, or what's on that left-hand side, is both of those things. It's this, I'll highlight it, and it's also this. They're both the same thing. 4 groups of x minus 2 is the same thing as x minus 8, because there's one group of x minus 2, there's another group of x minus 2, another group, and another group. So if we see them as being either 4 groups of x minus 2 or, alternately, 4x minus 8, then we're able to solve it either way. If I think of it this way, what I'm really going to do first is I'm going to add 8 to both sides. And if I add 8 to that side, I'm going to add 8 to this side. And when I do so, those are all 0 pairs. Those are all 0 pairs. I'm going to get lazy. I have 4 x's left over here and negative 4 left over here. If 4x equals negative 4, then each of these x's are going to have a value of negative 1, and therefore the solution is each of those x's is equal to negative 1. The next question says solve using distributive property. So again, we have the exact same question. If I go back here, there it is, equals negative, what was it? I can't remember the question. Negative 12. Equals negative 12. And it's the exact same question we just drew, except now we're going to solve it using distributive property. So what's meant by that is you need to interpret that 4 groups of x minus 2 is 4 x's and a minus 8. Each of the terms in the bracket, the x and the minus 2, must be multiplied by 4 to expand. We call this expanding using distributive property. And I'll put dp instead of distributive property. So 4x minus 8 equals negative 12. Some people think I have to multiply this negative 12 by 4 as well, and that's not true. Negative 12 is by itself over there. You don't have to multiply that by. So now we have a two-step algebraic equation. Add 8 to both sides to get rid of the constant. 4x equals, as Nicole will tell you, negative 12 and positive 8 make negative 4. Divide both sides by 4. And the value of x, again, just like in the last question, is still negative 1. And your last question in the 9-fer, exact same question except it says use division first. And if I go back to that question, if we look at the model that we started with, what we could do here is instead of, I'm just going to grab this whole thing and bring it over here. Instead of expanding, saying it's 4x minus 8, what I can really do is take each of these groups of x minus 2 and put them on their own scale. So an x minus 2 goes here, an x minus 2 goes here, an x minus 2 goes here, and an x minus 2 goes there. Divide them into 4 scales. Divide these equally amongst the 4 as well, which would be 3 negatives on each of them. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying that if 4 groups of x minus 2 equals negative 12, then each group of x minus 2 is equal to negative 3. Now ultimately what we're going to do here is we're not going to draw that. But what we are going to do is, just like I did right here, I'm going to divide both sides into 4 groups. And 4 groups of x minus 2 is going to be 1 group of x minus 2. Because instead of saying 4 groups of it, I'm going to say 1 group of it is equal to negative 12 divided by 4, which is negative 3. So if 4 groups of if 4 groups of x minus 2 is equal to negative 12, then 1 group of x minus 2 is equal to negative 3. And now that I'm here, I'm going to add 2 to both sides. I get x equals negative 1.